But right now, we're going to hear a great talk from a great friend of mine who's leading a church with a big vision. They've created a culture of evangelism. Their axiom is making the city a bigger place. So I'm delighted that my friend, founding senior pastor, along with his wife Cheryl, of Coastal Church, Dr. David Koop, is going to challenge us, inspire us about how big our evangelism is. So fasten your seatbelts, you're in for a treat. Here comes Dr. David Koop.
Pastor Dave Koop here from Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. I'm going to be speaking with you today about how big is your vision for evangelism. I want to lay out for you in the next few minutes 4 factors. Number 1, your focus. Number 2, your love. Number 3, your generosity. And finally, number 4, your commitment. Let's talk about these things. In order to see how big your vision for evangelism is, we have to talk about where are you focusing. The question is, what are you looking at? Jesus, in John chapter 4, you know the story. It's a story where he meets the woman at the well. And there, after his disciples had brought some food to him, and he's having this conversation with them, he talks about the harvest. And he tells them in John chapter 4, verse 35, he says this to them, "Behold, I say to you, lift up your eyes and look at the fields, for they are ready white for harvest." This is what he's saying to us today when we're talking about how big is our vision for evangelism. He's saying, lift up your eyes, look at the fields. There's a harvest that's waiting. To lift up my eyes means I was looking down. If I look down, what do I see? I see my feet, I see my knees, I see myself. The principle is simple. In order to see the harvest, you have to take your eyes off yourself. If I take my eyes off myself, my 4 and no more, I'm going to see the harvest. It's important that we look out and see the harvest. It's possible that we can get so busy in our own little world that we don't even see the harvest anymore. There's an interesting theory from an eye doctor in New York. I'm going to put up a picture of this high-rise city, this picture of New York. Here in New York, all these big high-rises. And his theory was this: people there were nearsighted because they were always focusing on short distances. Rarely would they look up beyond the buildings and see a greater distance. As a result of it, they became nearsighted. And he writes this theory that in order to have good eyesight, we've got to look beyond. And for some of us, we don't see beyond our own world and to see out there this great harvest. Jesus said, look up for the harvest. Look beyond what you're seeing around you to see the needs of other people. The harvest, we need to have a vision for the harvest. In order to have a vision for the harvest again, we have to get our eyes off ourselves. When God talks about the harvest, he's talking about a big harvest. He's not talking about a hobby farm. Some people have a hobby farm and they don't really need the farm to make a living. It's just something they enjoy to do. Where I grew up in southern Alberta, just a little bit south and east of Pincher Creek, Alberta, some of you Albertans will know where that is, we had a harvest. But it wasn't a harvest, a hobby farm. Our harvest was all about our whole living. And when harvest time came, we focused on the harvest. It was about the harvest. We had machinery, but the focus wasn't on machinery. We had systems, but the focus wasn't really on the systems. Everything was focused on the harvest. In the church world, we can have systems and machinery and equipment and cameras and online and all these different things. At the end of the day, it's a focus on the harvest. And I believe if we have our eyes focused on the harvest, it's going to keep us in the middle of the road. It'll help us, and it helps the harvest when we focus on the harvest. So that would be the first question is, are we focused on the harvest? How big is your vision for evangelism? It'll be dependent upon how much we focus on the harvest. Rick Warren once said, "A great commitment to the great commandment and the great commission will build a great church." What a powerful statement. A great commitment to the great commandment. Love your neighbor as yourself. The great commission by Jesus, go into all the world. It was the great commission, not the great suggestion, go into all the world. Focus on the harvest. The great commandment has a lot to do with compassion, which leads to the second factor. How do you have a big vision for evangelism? Focus on the harvest. Number two, a lot of it depends upon our love. Do you see the harvest? Number two, do you love the harvest? Do you see your neighbor? Do you love your neighbor? It starts there. You know, once upon a time, we'd have barbecues with our neighbors. We had front porches. We sat on the front porch and greeted our neighbors. Today's world is different. Where I live in downtown Vancouver, to go into our apartment building, you swipe in, you swipe up your elevator, and then there's another security to get into your apartment. There's a concierge, there's security. Very hard for us to know our neighbors. We've lived in that apartment for a number of years, and it's difficult to get to know our neighbors in that building. Occasionally, we might meet them on the elevator, but that's about it. If you live in a suburb, you drive up to your home, you press the garage door button, you drive in, the garage door closes, you go in, you have fences around your backyard, and occasionally you might wave to your neighbor. The point is that we don't know our neighbors like we used to. In order to have a big vision for evangelism, I think it starts with what Jesus said, to love literally our neighbor. It's more than a metaphor. We actually need to know who our neighbors are. In the book, The Art of Neighboring, Jay Pathak and Dave Runyon did a survey, and they asked people if they could name their 8 closest neighbors. Let me ask you today, do you know the names of your 8 closest neighbors? They found out that only 10% had their names. Regarding some relevant information about them, like where they're from and so forth, only 3% knew that. The point of their book was, we don't even know our neighbors. If we want to have a big vision for evangelism, we have to focus on the harvest, and we have to do what Jesus said, literally love our neighbors. It starts as an evangelist right with our neighbors next door. We had a neighbor, and his name was Walter. And Walter was kind of a grumpy old guy. And I'd do my best to talk to him, got to know him, know his world, and he liked wine, and he liked growing trees, and he was a Dutch person we had some things in common. And every time I brought up a story of faith or talked about the Lord, he just put up a wall. But a little over a year ago, we found out that Walter was dying. And we went over to see him a few times. And then one day, the woman that he lived with said, "You need to come see Walter." And we were busy. We were heading out, but we said, "No, let's drop it. Let's go see Walter." And that day, as we went to visit Walter, we stood around him. I read Psalm 23 for him. And something happened at that moment that Walter opened up his heart. All those seeds had been planted and watered over the years by myself and others. Just days before he passed away, he made Jesus Christ the Lord of his life. And I'm so glad that the Holy Spirit had nudged me to get out of my comfort zone and to talk to a neighbor who sometimes was grumpy with me. Do we know our neighbors? Focus on the harvest. Number 2, love those who are around us. That's how we have a big vision for evangelism. In Matthew chapter 9, verses 36 to 38, this is out of the Amplified Bible. But here it says, talking about Jesus, when he saw the throngs, he was moved with pity and sympathy for them because they were bewildered, harassed, and distressed, and dejected and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to the disciples, "The harvest is indeed plentiful, but the laborers are few. So pray to the Lord of the harvest to force out and thrust laborers into his harvest." That's pretty strong language. Really strong language. But here Jesus is emphatically saying, look at the harvest, pray for the laborers in the harvest. But this whole thing starts with Jesus moved with compassion. Want to have a big vision for evangelism? Focus on the harvest. Number 2, love the harvest, love the people, and that starts with our own neighbors. Number 3, it's about our generosity. Do you see them? Do you love them? Number 3, do you give to them? We know this verse, John 3:16. For God so loved that he what? Gave. If we want to have a big vision for evangelism, I promise you this, we're giving into evangelism. Whether it be this summit, whether it be another organization, our local church, but we're giving into missions. We're giving into evangelism. If I was to look at where your finances went, we'd know whether you had a big vision for evangelism. For you know what Jesus said. He said, where your treasures, there your heart will be also. When did he say that? He said, don't store up for yourself treasures on earth, moth and rust destroy, but store up for yourself treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroy, where thieves don't break in and steal. For wherever your treasures, that's where your heart's going to be also. So how do we have a big vision for evangelism? Number 3, we are generous towards it. The degree of how much we give into evangelism is directly related to how much we love our broken world. Then number 4, our bigness in vision for evangelism is, I believe, directly related to our commitment to the local church. Our generosity and our commitment. Why? Because when we bring in the harvest, the question is, where do we bring them? Growing up on the farm, we were committed. We saw the harvest. We were focused on it. We were thankful for the blessing of the harvest. We poured into what it cost to bring off the harvest. But when we brought in the harvest, we didn't just lay it out on the ground somewhere. That harvest was dedicated to a bin to protect it. And when we bring in the harvest, where does the harvest go? The harvest belongs in the local church. Jesus had said, I will build my church. Where does the harvest come? Into the local church. Why? Because that's where people are going to flourish. So I think to have a big vision for evangelism, there's also a great love for the local church. Let me put up this picture of a cornfield. This is a big cornfield in Iowa. Lots of corn. They did a study on corn in Iowa, the agricultural school there. They found out that to grow 100 bushels of corn from 1 acre of land, it required 4 million pounds of water, 6,800 pounds of oxygen, 5,200 pounds of carbon, 160 pounds of nitrogen, 125 pounds of potassium, 75 pounds of sulfur, lots of sunshine. But the amazing thing they found out, that only 5% of this great crop was because of the farmer's work. You know what? That reminds me of the harvest that God's brought us into. This is God's work. He said, I will build my church. Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 6 to 8, I planted the seed in your hearts, Apollos watered it, but it was God who made it grow. What's God's project? The church. Who makes the harvest grow? God. What do? That's 5%. That's what we're about. It's not important who does the planting or who does the watering. What's important is that God makes the seed grow. Sounds like God's invested a lot into the harvest. Sounds like this is his idea. And he needs us to have a big vision for what he's doing. God has a dream. The dream is for many to come not be lost, but to be saved. So, if we want to have a big vision for evangelism, let me ask you these 4 factors again. Where is your focus? Are you looking at the harvest? Number 2, your love. Do you love the harvest? Are you moved by compassion? And number 3, are you generous with your time, your money? Are you stewarding what you have, even your contacts? And then number 4, are you committed to the local church, which is this is all about? As Jesus said in Matthew 16:18, now I say to you, Peter, which means rock, upon this rock I will build my church, and all the powers of hell will not conquer it. My friend, Jesus is building his church. He needs you and I as laborers, and he needs us to have a big vision for evangelism. In a few moments, you're going to break out into some groups and reflect on this. And I'd encourage you to reflect on a scale of 1 to 10. How would you rate your vision for evangelism? How well do you know your closest 8 neighbors? Which one of these factors could you maybe improve on? Hey, I'm praying for you. I'm believing that God's going to increase your vision for evangelism through this summit.